Instead of focusing on the time that Rudolph was on the run, I'd like to revisit and hammer home the ideas that led Rudolph to the brink in which he felt compelled to construct bombs and murder people, all the time believing himself to be justified. Whichever belief you'd like to choose as a jumping off point, it really doesn't matter. They all kind of intersect and intertwine. They all lead back to the idea that Marxism is undermining the United States. From his time in the Birch Society to the Christian identity movement, from his belief that CRT was indoctrinating students and that universities were just communist brainwashing factories, to the idea that sexual liberation, sex out of wedlock, a woman's right to choose, LGBTQ rights, all just being assaults on a traditional family unit, of which, again, Marxism or egalitarianism or neo-Marxist or whatever you want to call the bad people were attempting to undermine. And why? Why were these bad people attempting to undermine? Because it's an attack on Western civilization and Christianity. And that was really his main thesis. Rudolph even lamented that his logic and facts couldn't act as rebuttal against his foe. I hope that you're hearing things that sound familiar. I hope you started making the connections in your mind from Rudolph's extremist ideologies and modern right-wing talking points, however they self-describe themselves. Ties to modern politics. Tea Party movement and MAGA, in words if not deed, and movements. And so the jumping off point for us would be the Patriot movement. And Rudolph discusses the Patriot movement in depth. At 15, I wasn't really up on my politics. I'd never seen any evidence of an impending United Nations takeover, but what did I know? I had, however, done a tour of duty in South Florida's public schools, where the teachers taught us guilt and self-hate, where drugs and violence were the norm. I no longer trusted the system. The culture war that the Patriots spoke of was something I'd experienced firsthand, and unlike the Pentecostals, who had told us to become doormats, the Patriots talked about resistance. Talk of a coming war intrigued me. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had purpose. And isn't that just quintessential? I mean, that's Hollywood script. That's someone writing the development of a terrorist. Well, Rudolph goes on to explain the evolution of the Patriot movement. He discusses in the 1970s how many Christians joined in opposition in social issues like abortion and LGBTQ rights. This greatly influenced the potential for a true nationalist revolution, according to Rudolph. Although they share these grievances with the Christian activists, Patriots tend to focus on issues like income tax, property rights, and the United Nations. Gun rights are the big issue for Patriots. Gun rights are not about duck hunting, target shooting, or home protection. To them, the founding fathers wrote the Second Amendment for the express purpose of keeping an armed citizenry as a check against out-of-control governments. When they wrote that amendment, the founders were thinking of Lexington and Concord, where well-armed citizens took up arms against their own governments. The Patriots believe that losing our Second Amendment right is a final step in the conspiracy. Once the state has our guns, we can do nothing to stop the socialists from dismantling the rest of our Constitution and reducing us all to slavery. It sounds like any right-wing conspiracist in 2022, doesn't it? I was going to say Alex Jones, but not even Alex Jones. You can find this on any comment section of a mainstream article on some mainstream media platform. In a moment of clarity, Rudolph calls out conspiracy theorists making money off of patriots. Essentially, he calls out the early grifters. The people who talked about black helicopters and false flags that sell survival gear and food. It's Alex Jones, right? He states that conspiracies essentially neutralize the patriot movement and keeps it from action, like the action that he took. Like the Republican Party, in essence, Rudolph had disillusionment with the patriot movement. However, the patriot movement in a broader sense is important to the story. It cultivated Rudolph's beliefs and his extremism. It was a counterculture to its own. It was conservatives working from outside the system, which they felt was incapable of and not interested in listening to them. Groups such as the Idaho Lightfoot Militia, Militia of Montana, and Michigan Militia came to prominence. While many sources on the movement discuss sovereign citizens or anti-tax ideologies, they fail to delve into the deeply held conspiracies, the Bircherism, the anti-Marxism, the one world government stuff, Christian identity, racism, militarism, all the things that forged figures such as Eric Rudolph. These were the grandfathers to modern day Oath Keepers and 3%ers. This is where the Eric Rudolph story begins to get interesting. Up to now, really, we've just discussed the self-aggrandizing self-biography of a terrorist, eyewitness accounts, and historical facts surrounding that terrorist attacks. We've talked about his beliefs and a little regarding how they are mimicked in various ways by modern right-wing voices. However, there is a line that exists from Rudolph and expanding out to include Timothy McVeigh and other right-wing terrorists from the 1990s to the modern Republican Party. Ideas that existed in various factions of the Patriot movement manifested later in Tea Party style Republicans, culminating in the modern GOP, which, as we will see, is not a center or center-right party at the moment. Some of Donald Trump's most ardent supporters had roots in the Tea Party movement. According to Pew Research, Republicans who had favorable views of the Tea Party movement were among top donors to Trump's campaign. Pew also found those who supported or participated in the Tea Party movement had very high views of Trump, giving him a 78 out of 100 in February 2018. While the Tea Party presented itself as a patriotic and fiscally conservative movement, in reality, it was the place of birtherism, the Manchurian Candidate conspiracies, white replacement conspiracies, and narratives of cultural Islamic and Marxist invasion. It combined previously separate movements such as anti-choice and anti-tax. It decried political correctness in the name of free speech and launched fringe media personalities such as Glenn Beck and Rush Limbaugh to success. It was the movement of movements for the right, and all tightly connected by, when reduced, what ultimately amounts to Birch Society anti-Marxist conspiracies rebranded. It was QAnon before QAnon, and the political groundwork for MAGA. It began holding Republican officials accountable for their lack of extremism, and it was the birthplace of the term rhino, Republican in name only. This is also the period in which various groups that were either directly related to or birthed from the 1990s Patriot movement became politically active. This gave rise to candidates such as Ted Cruz, who drug along such groups as the Oath Keepers. Eric Rudolph wrote extensively about how he decided to act in violence because the Republican Party was unwilling to do so politically. Rudolph wrote moderates like Dwight D. Eisenhower worked for an accommodation with the new masters of America. They accepted the social democratic welfare state and ceded the culture to the left. They turned American conservatism into a stodgy Burkean brand of classical liberalism, rather than a real alternative to socialism. Patriots believe that the country is already lost, and all constitutional efforts to win back our liberties have failed. America now belongs to a group of socialists intent on merging our country into a one world government, which will be organized under the United Nations. The Tea Party movement was the house cleaning of moderates that Rudolph craved. It paved the way for extreme candidates and extreme ideas to become mainstreamed, all sharing the same core conspiracy-laden worldviews. Today, what was seen as fringe in the 1990s is mainstream right-wing rhetoric. The conspiracies and resentment expressed by Rudolph won Donald Trump the presidency. It's made media pundits on Fox News millions. It's escalated YouTube stars and fringe personalities from racist message boards to national prominence and into the cultural zeitgeist. The core conspiracies expressed by Rudolph regarding Marxism, CRT, feminism, LGBTQ rights, destruction of the traditional family unit, and an attack on Western civilization is normal, common, mainstream right-wing opinion today. Let's look back on this slide that discusses Eric Rudolph's beliefs. Feminism, abortion, patriarchy, Marxism, gun laws, LGBTQ rights, religious fundamentalism. The normies have been pilled. The normies have been pilled. This is now primetime Fox News rhetoric. Nothing extreme about it. And along with the politics of the Tea Party era, the idea of fragmentation and groups being formed, the idea of the Patriot movement, including many different militias and various groups, is also now mainstreamed. What do I mean by that? I mean that on your commute to work any day of the week, you might see an Oath Keepers bumper sticker or a 3% bumper sticker, or someone at the gym with a Proud Boys shirt on. All of these gangs, and that's what they are. These are gangs and anti-government militias. All of these things, and let's throw QAnon in there too, operate openly and publicly as if they're anything but domestic terrorist extremist organizations. And where has that mainstreaming of right-wing extremism gotten us? Well, it's culminated in an insurrection. An attack on the nation's Capitol building during the certification process of electoral votes, which is a procedural method for a peaceful transition of power and a fundamental linchpin to American democracy. Present at this insurrection were the very fringe groups that came from or were born from the 1990s Patriot movement, the Tea Party movement, and various internet movements too complex to break down in this episode. we aren't just talking about fringe groups joining a larger protest or a few politicians with far-right views. The way in which self-identified Republicans and Democrats view the events, which are an objective reality, differ. There is a difference in perceptions of reality. To reiterate just how integrated right-wing extremism has become within the mainstream Republican Party, on February 4th, the Republican Party censored U.S. Representatives Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger for joining Congress's investigation of the January 6th Capitol attack and Donald Trump's effort to overturn his 2020 presidential election defeat. The Republican Party, the official Republican Party, called those actions legitimate political discourse. In the opening paragraphs of the document drafted by the Republican Party, it states, the Biden administration and Democrats in Congress have embarked on a systemic effort to replace liberty with socialism. The exact same accusation leveled by Rudolph and McVeigh years earlier. It isn't that these are coincidentally shared opinions or that Republicans are all of a sudden terrorists because of this statement. So, that's illogical and we can disregard it. No. This is an example of a shared belief system, a shared worldview, a shared ideology amongst all involved with historical roots. Conclusions. There's a lot to draw from Eric Rudolph's actions and his beliefs. I've expanded this discussion far beyond that of Rudolph's bombs and the time that he spent on the FBI's top 10 wanted list. And admittedly, some of this is observational. However, for as much as Rudolph wanted to try and portray himself as a man alone, he clearly is not. Socialization agents, from his father's views on his school teacher to his mother's involvement in the Christian identity movement, forged his identity. His outings with the Birch Society as a child, to being exposed to various elements of the Patriot movement, helped form his worldviews. From the white nationalist magazines in his house to the open dialogue of Holocaust denial. And because of these, and the many more broader social and political movements discussed and not discussed in this episode, we also cannot paint Eric Rudolph as a lone wolf. He did not create his ideas in a vacuum. He did not act in a vacuum. And many of his beliefs are very much alive and well in our mainstream, normalized culture today. The lone wolf label isolates Rudolph and makes him seem an independent individual crazy who just so happened to share the exact same beliefs with so many other people in politics and the broader social movements and right-wing ecosphere today. It would be akin to saying all of the people that stormed the Capitol building on January 6th were just a collection of lone wolves. A piece of Rudolph's story is that he got what he wanted. Ultimately, Rudolph acted because he felt Republicans did not. The rise of the Tea Party, culminating in MAGA, and the current state of the GOP is really what Rudolph wanted so many years ago. Rudolph is a talented writer and well-articulated. Reading his essays, I couldn't help but think of the many well-articulated social media personalities that present themselves with an air of intellectualism and authority today. However, I also couldn't help but see the connections and themes and ideas between them and Eric either. These comparisons should not be overstated to force a narrative, for sure. However, they cannot be ignored or dismissed either, as they exist.